Hi everyone, in this video we're going to look at how we render using flat tones and gradient tones that we've learned about in a previous video. I've got a cube and a cylinder, and for the cube we're going to render using some flat tones, and then for the cylinder we're going to render using gradient tones. Again, really important to make sure that when you're rendering you've got a nice sharp pencil and that you're holding it in one consistent direction and you keep your lines nice and close together. So starting off with the cube, I'm going to look at how I render that with some flat tones. I'm going to build up one layer of colour over everything and then build up different layers on each surface just depending on how much light is attracted to each surface. So I'm going to imagine that I've got a source of light up here pointing down and flooding the shape along the top and along this front surface, but leaving this surface furthest away from the light, meaning that it's a lot darker than the rest. Using what was in my previous flat tones tonal scale, I'm going to treat this surface as being the lightest, so it would get my palest tone, tone 1. This tone would be in the middle, around a 3 or 4, and then this one at the far side would be a 6, because again it's getting the least light. So I'll start off, hold my pencil nice and low to the page, and building up one even layer of colour, trying to make sure that I keep my lines consistent, covering the whole shape and not making it messy or scribbly, trying to stay as much as I can inside the lines, but don't worry if you do go outside them, because we've got a little trick to make it stand out at the end. So every surface now has a 1. We're now going to leave this top surface and we're going to render these to have extra layers. Now if you wanted to make sure that you're not going to go into that top layer, you can always use a ruler or a set square to help stop going into that top surface, and that's what I'll do for this one here. I'm just going to place a set square against that top edge just to help me stop from going into the next part of the box. I'll start keeping the same direction, build this up so that I now have a second layer of colour across the whole cube, missing out that top surface obviously. We talked about this one being a 3 or a 4, so let's add a third coat across each surface. And I think that will be enough to show a clear difference between the two. So now I'm going to bring my set square or my ruler across this line, and I'm going to go 4, 5 and probably 6 onto this layer. Again, trying to keep the same direction. That's 4, 5, and probably for that 6th layer, what I'll need to do is make sure I put just a little bit more pressure onto the pencil, just so I can get that clear difference in tone. What we can see now is we've got clear differences between the top surface, which would get the most light from our light source, this left hand surface, which would get slightly more light than this surface but less than the top, and this surface here, which has the least amount of light. Now to allow me to make this object stand out, I'm just going to go around the boundary of the object with a Fineliner pen. You could do this with a pen if you have one, or alternatively what you'll be able to do is just lean quite firmly with your original pencil, or better still, if you had a rubber or an eraser, what you could do is place your straight edge onto the edge and then just use an eraser to rub out those extra lines. You'll notice that I've missed out the lines in the centre, and that is purely because the change in light and the change in colour should be enough to show that this is a three-dimensional object. Now that we've experimented using flat tones, we're going to work on using the gradient tones for this cylinder. The lighting works slightly differently, and this time I'll work as if the light is coming from up here, meaning that the top surface would get most of the light, but because we've got this surface here which is curved, the light would hit it around here, but as it moves round it would become darker as it gets further away in a steady gradient. Similarly, as it starts to move around the back and get further away from our light source, what we would see is it would start to get dark around that edge there. What I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to rotate my page round so that I can work parallel to this edge. I'm also going to make sure when I first render that I'm going to include this top surface. So I start again keeping my pencil tones nice and even just to add one layer of colour along the top. And then I'm going to start with my gradient tone technique, which is a little bit more difficult because I'm going to try and stay away from this line, but it's a good skill to try and master. If you're really struggling with that, sometimes putting the edge of your thumb or one of your fingers is a good way of just giving your pencil a bit of direction to make sure you don't creep into that area. So I'll start working from this edge. Nice even tone, and I'm going to stop about 3/4 of the way around and then go back to the start and stop a little bit short again, and each time building those layers upon layers of colour to show that as it moves round the back of the cylinder, less light is getting to it, and it means the colour tones are a lot darker. I'm keeping lots and lots of layers, building up that colour, particularly this edge, trying to make it as dark as possible, and then a nice steady blend the rest of the way around. What I'll then do is rotate my page 180 degrees. I'm going to apply the same technique but over a very small area. I want to keep this area here as light as possible and this area here as dark as possible. So I start from here and very quickly stop. And I'm just doing a really quick transition of light to dark. And then on this final line, what I would probably do is just move my pencil grip right to the tip and then put a nice firm line in amongst there. Now what we can also see is on the top, that surface is still very pale, probably too pale. So what I'm going to do is rotate my page back round and just add one extra layer of colour onto here. Again, what we should hopefully see is that it looks like a cylindrical object. Imagine it's like a can of juice or a tin of beans, where if the light hit it you get that kind of bright white stripe down the front of it. And just to finish off what I'm doing, I'll go round the perimeter, round the outside of the object with a fine line pen. Remember, it doesn't have to be a pen, you could also be using your coloured pencil just a little bit more firmly. The one thing that isn't as clear in our gradient tones is the difference between the two edges. To help with this, what you can do is gradually build up this line here, but working on it in the same way you would work on the gradient, gradually moving further away, closer to this corner, just building up a few layers just to show that this line itself is changing in colour. And again round there. You've now got the opportunity to create these shapes yourself and apply flat tones and gradient tones to different objects to show how light affects their colour.